Nearly a year later, when Brigadier General Clifford Blumel and I were sitting in rags in a prison camp near Tarlik, we discussed the conditions under which our divisions formed. What I am saying is this: our units were doomed before they started to fight. They never had a chance to win. That they lasted as long as they did is a stirring and touching tribute to their gallantry and fortitude. Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright.
As part of their plan to seize resource-rich territories held by Europe and the United States, Imperial Japanese forces, under the command of General Masaharu Homma, invaded the Philippines on 8 December 1941. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements by the attack on Pearl Harbor, General Douglas MacArthur organized the United States Army Forces Far East, or USAFE, to defend the Philippines' strategically important harbor at Manila, as Japanese troops steadily advanced towards the city from both the north and south. To delay the Japanese, General MacArthur organized his forces into 5 corps-sized elements. The North Luzon Force, under the command of Major General Jonathan M. Wainwright, the South Luzon Force, under the command of Brigadier General George M. Parker, Jr., and 3 others, the Reserve Force, the Bisayan Mindanao Force, and the Harbor Defense Force. However, as the Japanese gained air superiority and the U.S. Asiatic Fleet withdrew to Australia, MacArthur's soldiers, under staggering pressure from a well-coordinated joint attack by the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, were forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. With War Plan Orange in effect, MacArthur shifted focus from destroying Japanese forces attempting to invade Luzon to delaying their advance long enough to allow him to withdraw his forces to the Bataan Peninsula. From there, USAFE was to hold until supplies and reinforcements could arrive. Holding Bataan also supported the goal of defending Manila Bay and denying its use to the Japanese. It was an operationally sound decision. Withdrawing his forces to the peninsula would negate the Japanese numerical advantage and allow MacArthur to concentrate his defense along a narrow front. To accomplish this, MacArthur ordered the relocation of USAFE headquarters to Corregidor, after which he declared Manila an open city.
General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, announced, to spare the capital from the ravages of war, I have today declared Manila as an open city. To avoid every possible danger, the Office of the American High Commissioner, the Commonwealth Government, and Army headquarters will immediately evacuate the city of Manila and the special districts around it.
While USAFE forces delayed the Japanese, supplies had to be moved to Bataan and Corregidor. Admiral Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, left the Philippines on 25 December to join his naval forces to the south. He left Admiral Rockwell in command of a regiment of Marines, 3 gunboats, 3 minesweepers, and 6 motor torpedo boats. He also gave orders for the evacuation of Cabite's naval facilities, the destruction of oil and gasoline stores in Manila, and the removal of any remaining supplies to either Corregidor or Maribalis on the Bataan Peninsula. General Brereton, commander of the Far Eastern Air Force, left as well to join his bombers at Bachelor Field in northern Australia, leaving only a small number of fighters and their pilots with support crews under the command of Colonel Harold H. George. These airmen would eventually become infantry soldiers when no replacement aircraft arrived. In the meantime, General Wainwright's North Luzon forces prepared to implement the withdrawal plan outlined in War Plan Orange as directed by General MacArthur. Under this plan, Wainwright's forces were to keep the junction open where Route 7, the road into Bataan, intersected with Route 3. This was to be accomplished through successive withdrawals along 5 defensive lines, curving south towards Bataan. Each position was to be held only long enough to allow the enemy to prepare an organized attack and then abandon for the next defensive position further south.
Army doctrine explains that a delay is one of the most demanding ground combat operations. A delay wears down the enemy so that friendly forces can regain the initiative through offensive action, buy time to establish an effective defense, or determine enemy intentions as part of a security operation. Normally in a delay, inflicting casualties is secondary to gaining time. Except when directed to prevent enemy penetration of a phase line for a specific duration, a force conducting a delay avoids becoming decisively engaged. Delays typically require areas of operation with significant depth to enable forces to trade space for time. Like other operations, commanders organize their forces into a security force, a main body, and a reserve. The security force conducts reconnaissance operations to determine the enemy's scheme of maneuver. The main body is assigned an area of operations that includes the enemy's most likely avenue of approach. The main body then begins engagement area development while also preparing primary, supplementary, and subsequent battle positions. Primary positions are positions that cover the enemy's most likely avenue of approach into the area of operations. Supplementary positions are defensive positions that provide the best sectors of fire in defensive terrain along an avenue of approach that is not the primary avenue where the enemy is expected to attack. Subsequent positions are positions that a unit expects to move to during the course of a battle. In addition to battle positions, phase lines, and engagement areas, delays have several unique control measures used to coordinate maneuver and fires to delay within the time requirements established by the commander. These include delay lines, trigger lines, and disengagement lines. A delay line is a phase line where the date and time before which the enemy is not allowed to cross the phase line is depicted as part of the graphic control measure. A trigger line is a phase line located on identifiable terrain that crosses the engagement area and is used to initiate mass fires into the engagement area. Commanders may also establish engagement criteria to be used in conjunction with a trigger line. For example, engagement criteria may consist of a specified number of enemy troops or vehicles entering the engagement area or crossing the trigger line before friendly forces are permitted to engage. A disengagement line is a phase line located on identifiable terrain that, when crossed by the enemy, signals to defending elements that it is time to displace to their next position. Commanders also establish disengagement criteria, such as a number of enemy vehicles by type entering the engagement area, friendly losses, or enemy movement to flanking locations. Disengagement criteria and disengagement lines are used to prevent friendly forces from becoming decisively engaged. The delay begins with friendly forces occupying their battle positions. Once enemy forces cross the trigger line, friendly forces mass fires into the engagement areas until the enemy crosses the disengagement line. When the enemy crosses the disengagement line, friendly forces begin moving to their subsequent battle positions. This movement is typically staggered by units and battle positions to maintain contact with the enemy. They employ indirect fire, electronic warfare, and obscuration fires to cover and screen their movement. The reserve force may also be used to help the main body disengage. Similar to when a force bounds forward, a delaying force breaking contact with the enemy withdraws to either successive or alternate battle positions. More flexible than successive positions, alternate positions are arrayed along different phase lines and are used in areas of operation with significant depth. However, alternate positions require numerous rearward passage of lines that can complicate operations. Conversely, successive battle positions are arrayed along the same phase line and are used when an area of operations is wider than it is deep. Successive positions enable the commander to mass fires from all combat elements on the enemy. Whether withdrawing to successive or alternate positions, forces continue to delay in this manner until either the conditions established by the commander have been met or the force is no longer capable of mounting an effective defense. The delay succeeds by forcing the enemy to repeatedly concentrate forces to fight through a series of well-prepared defenses, thereby buying time and exhausting the attacking force.
A delaying action would allow the South Luzon force, now under command of Major General Albert M. Jones, to withdraw west and north along their own successive defensive lines leading around Manila. They would then cross the Pampanga River by way of the two bridges at Calumpit, moved to San Fernando, and then turned south, moving into Bataan. While the North Luzon Force delayed, the Bataan Defense Force, comprised of those soldiers already in place, with the Philippine 31st and 41st Infantry Divisions, would prepare the peninsula's line of defense under General Parker. MacArthur hoped the protracted withdrawal of the North Luzon Force during the day would slow the Japanese by causing them to deploy their forces before each line. Then, at night, he would withdraw his soldiers under cover of darkness, leaving a small force of infantry and artillery to defend their withdrawal. Before dawn, these forces would withdraw to avoid being targeted by enemy aircraft. The delay was designed to buy time for the South Luzon Force to make it safely to Bataan by the cutoff date of 8 January. The delaying positions, numbered D1 through D5, had been reconnoitered before the war by U.S. forces and selected to maximize the use of terrain features as strong points to anchor them to the high ground.
According to Army Doctrine Publication 3-90, a strong point is a heavily fortified battle position tied to a natural or reinforcing obstacle to create an anchor for the defense or to deny the enemy decisive or key terrain.
Each line was approximately one night's march away from each other. Line D5 was the only phase line designated for a protracted defense, since it was the area through which both South and North Luzon forces would move through to Bataan. Although unit histories refer to D1 through D5 as lines, they were in actuality too large an area to be covered by available forces, and were only delaying positions designed to be held for one day, before defending forces retrograded to the next line further south. In support of these delaying actions, General Weaver's Provisional Tank Group was to cover the withdrawal by counterattacking along enemy avenues of approach and halting the enemy's tanks. By deploying on opposite sides of the road at curves and bends, they hoped to leverage their main gun's ability to traverse and employ overlapping fields of fire. This tactic would also enable them to maintain an escape route. Engineers, primarily from the 91st Philippine Division, would also play a significant part in these delaying actions, since they were responsible for maintaining roads and bridges ahead of the forces falling back, as well as destroying those same roads and bridges to halt the enemy's advance. Overall, the withdrawal plan had been well prepared ahead of time. Unfortunately, the Bataan Defense Force still faced two major obstacles. First, Japanese air power continued to harass and attack them. Second, was the tension caused between supplying the forces fighting the delay and the simultaneous storing of supplies on Bataan for the embittered siege that was to follow. On the afternoon of 24 December, the North Luzon Force was positioned roughly along phase line D1, facing the Lingayen Gulf. This line extended west from Urdaneta on Route 3 to San Carlos and ended at Aguilar on Route 13. All units were under orders to hold until 1900 hours before falling back to the Agno River. To the east, the 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts had already withdrawn across the Agno River at Tayug to anchor the North Luzon Force at the start of the withdrawal to phase line D2. To the west of Tayug, the 11th Philippine Division and 192nd Tank Battalion defended along the center of the line from Urdaneta to San Carlos. They were awaiting further armor reinforcements from the 194th, which had departed from Manila that morning. Further west, the 21st Division held from San Carlos to the Zambales Mountains. These soldiers had not yet engaged the enemy. At 1900, defenders along the line began to retrograde, blowing bridges across the Agno River to line D2. Shortly after noon on 25 December, an advance element of the Japanese 48th Reconnaissance Regiment engaged patrols of the 26th Cavalry near Tayug. By 0400 on 26 December, Tayug was in Japanese hands. The Japanese crossed the Agno around 1800 near Villasis on the 26th. Late on that afternoon, Wainwright ordered the 11th Division to fall back to Route 3, then continue south to the D3 line. Despite occasional alarms, there was no action on the D3 line on 27 December. That night, the North Luzon force made ready to fall back to the D4 line. The Philippine 91st Division began withdrawing at about 1730, and by 0430, 28 December, had reached the south bank of the Pampanga River below Cabanatuan. Concerned that a quick withdrawal from the D4 line would threaten the North Luzon force's ability to hold the road long enough for the South Luzon force to complete its rearward passage of lines into Bataan, Wainwright ordered his forces to hold longer than planned at the D4 line in order to buy more time. By 29 December, the Japanese 48th Division had reached the D4 line. It had advanced in two columns. The west column, consisting of the 1st Formosa Regiment, supported by a battalion of artillery, advanced on Cabanatuan. The east column consisted of the 2nd Formosa Regiment, the 47th Infantry Regiment, and the 48th Reconnaissance Regiment. It advanced towards Tarlac, where it linked up with the 9th Infantry Regiment. Stout resistance by the U.S. and Filipino forces enabled them to cling to the D4 line throughout 30 December. By dawn on 31 December, Wainwright's North Luzon force was on the D5 line, holding the road open to Bataan. Wainwright's forces finally met with the South Luzon force outside the town of San Fernando. The road through the town leading onto the peninsula became a bottleneck, which the Japanese failed to target with their aircraft. However, Japanese tanks from the 7th Tank Regiment advanced to Baliwag, where they threatened to cut the path across the column pit bridges. They met Company C, 192nd Tank Battalion in the town, and suffered a defeat at the hands of the superior American Stuart tanks. By New Year's Day, all of the South Luzon force had moved into Bataan. Wainwright's rearguard forces then pulled back towards Layak and its single bridge across the Kutu River. There, the 26th Cavalry, elements of the Philippine 11th and 21st Divisions, and a handful of tanks delayed the Japanese, while the rest of the North Luzon force crossed into the peninsula. On 7 January at 0700, the 26th Cavalry crossed over the river and into Bataan. Before the Japanese attacked Bataan, MacArthur's forces experienced a bit of luck. Homa's most experienced division, the 48th, was reassigned to support the Dutch East Indies campaign. Inexperienced reservists from the 65th Brigade took their place. The brief halt in hostilities, as Homa reorganized part of his force, allowed the soldiers on Bataan time to prepare their defensive positions. MacArthur's plan for the defense of Bataan was based on an advanced defensive line separated in the middle by what was considered the impassable terrain of Mount Natib. However, Mount Natib's dense vegetation and elevation precluded its use as a strong point, as forces occupying the mountain were unable to use the position to mass fires on the enemy. Having consolidated on Bataan, MacArthur now reorganized his remaining forces into 2 corps, each tasked with defending a portion of the main defensive line. The western sector of the line was held by General Wainwright's 1st Philippine Corps, made up of the Philippine 1st, 31st, and 91st Infantry Divisions, a battery each of field artillery and self-propelled 75mm guns, and the resilient Philippine Scouts of the 26th Cavalry. Its main defensive positions crossed east, from the village of Maoban to the base of Mount Natib. Covering the eastern sector, 2nd Corps, commanded by Major General Parker, included the Philippine Army's 11th, 21st, 41st, and 51st Divisions, and the 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, with the U.S. Philippine Division held in reserve. 2nd Corps' main defensive positions stretched from the base of Mount Natib east to Mabatong and Manila Bay. USAFE supply officers forecasted that the Bataan Defense Forces required enough supplies for 43,000 soldiers to last 180 days. However, the actual number of troops that had withdrawn to Bataan was approximately 80,000, with an additional 26,000 civilians that had fled to the peninsula as well. Compounding this problem was MacArthur's initial attempt to defeat the Japanese without withdrawing to Bataan. In compliance with this plan, many supplies were moved to forward bases. Once MacArthur ordered the execution of War Plan Orange, these supplies now needed to be moved back to Bataan. A considerable amount went by ship from Manila, and some supplies came by truck and train from other locations. But much had to be destroyed or left behind, making food as valuable as ammunition in mounting an effective defense of the peninsula. This left MacArthur no choice but to order that his troops be placed on half rations. Wainwright recorded,
"The horses of the 26th Cavalry had to be shot by the men they had served so gallantly, and eaten by all of us. The horses had eaten all the rice straw stacks remaining in the tip of Bataan since the last harvest. There was no forage for them, and the tough meat became eagerly sought slivers in our rice."
On 9 January 1942, the Japanese initiated an artillery barrage against 2nd Corps, whose wider and flatter area of operations was less defensible than the narrow, hilly region 1st Corps occupied. Following the barrage, 2 regiments of Japanese infantry attacked, supported by artillery and tanks. For 7 days, 2nd Corps defended against the Japanese, who eventually penetrated its left flank and forced it to withdraw east and then south along the coast road. Fierce fighting also occurred between 1st Corps and the Japanese when they penetrated the defenders' front and eastern flank along Mount Natib, showing that the mountain's jungle was not as impenetrable as the Americans had estimated. Recognizing that both corps were outflanked along the divide between their forces, General MacArthur ordered their withdrawal to a new position on the night of 22 January. This new position was more defensible, running uninterrupted between the towns of Bagak on the west and Orion on the east. For 2 nights, both corps withdrew under the cover of 75mm guns and General Weaver's tank group in an effort to reestablish their new line of defense and make a final attempt to save Bataan. MacArthur wired General Marshall to report his situation and losses. He reported that he had lost 35% of his entire force, with some divisions only operating at 40% strength. He explained that the Japanese were now able to reinforce at will and that the defense of Bataan had become a battle of attrition. Attempting to turn both corps from their primary defensive positions, the Japanese conducted a series of amphibious landings south of the Orion-Bagak line between 23 January and 1 February. These attempts came to be called the Battle of the Points. The defenders consisted primarily of grounded pilots, members of the Philippine Constabulary Division, and headquarters and service troops. Nonetheless, they successfully held off the attackers.
The Battle of the Points is a textbook attempt at a turning movement. Field Manual 3-90-1 explains that a turning movement is a form of maneuver in which the attacking force seeks to avoid the enemy's principal defensive positions by seizing objectives behind the enemy's current positions, thereby causing the enemy force to move out of their current positions or divert major forces to meet the threat.
At the same time, the Battle of the Pockets began when Japanese forces attacked along the Orion-Bagak line, creating 2 pockets and a salient in 1st Corps' area of operations. In Wainwright's 1st Corps area, Japanese attacks were initially repulsed, but then Colonel Yorimasa Yoshioka's 20th Infantry Regiment found an opening on the Philippine 1st Regular Division's west flank and was able to penetrate into the division's rear. Yoshioka's force had difficulties navigating the dense jungle and soon split into 2 groups. The groups were eventually surrounded and attacked by units of the 11th and 51st Infantry Divisions. On 27 January, Lieutenant General Akira Nara's reinforced 65th Brigade attempted to penetrate 2nd Corps' defensive positions along a small path known as Trail Number 2. Elements of the Philippine 41st and 51st Infantry Regiments successfully defended against the Japanese advance, and on 2 February, 2nd Corps Commander, Major General Parker, ordered a counterattack that forced Nara to withdraw his troops. On 8 February, Lieutenant General Homa, after considering his increasing number of casualties, ordered a withdrawal of the 14th Army from their forward positions. He then called on Imperial Japanese headquarters to send reinforcements and conducted an operational pause until they arrived. This decision upset the Japanese timetable for operations in the South Pacific. Encouraged by their successful defense of the peninsula, soldiers in the field requested permission to pursue the enemy, but their requests were denied. MacArthur knew that his troops were isolated with limited resources, whereas the Japanese would receive aerial and naval resupply and reinforcements, originally destined for French Indochina. Instead, for the rest of February, MacArthur reconstituted his forces and strengthened their fortifications in preparation for the coming attacks. By the beginning of March, Lieutenant General Homa added the 4th Division to his 14th Army and received enough replacements to reconstitute his 16th Division. For the soldiers and civilians on Bataan, March saw the reduction of rations to 1,000 calories per day. The lack of food and the harsh jungle conditions increased the prevalence of disease. Crippled by the lack of sufficient medical supplies for combating malaria, many troops fell ill. At the end of the month, as the Japanese began their next assault on Bataan, Major General Parker estimated that his overall readiness had fallen by 20%. General Wainwright reported that only 25% of his soldiers were fit for duty. Wainwright later wrote in his memoirs,
If we had had something in our bellies, some hope that we could expect help from the United States, things might have been a little more endurable. But our perpetual hunger, the steaming heat by day and night, the terrible malaria for which we did not have enough quinine, and the moans of the wounded were terribly hard on the men. Especially when all this was piled on top of the knowledge that the Japanese were coming at us again, and there was little room for retreat.
Recognizing the precarious position of the forces defending the Bataan Peninsula, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to move to Australia. On 10 March, MacArthur briefed General Wainwright that he was leaving. MacArthur would retain command of the Philippine forces by establishing a liaison through his G4, Colonel Louis C. Beebe. He placed Wainwright in command of the newly formed Luzon force, with 4 subordinate commands reporting to him. MacArthur also left the harbor defenses that were still intact under the command of Major General George F. Moore. On 12 March, General MacArthur left Corregidor with his USAFE staff. His final orders to Wainwright included the need to defend in depth and to fight as long as there remained the ability to resist. On 19 March, General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, ordered Wainwright to assume command of all forces in the Philippines. On 21 March, Wainwright moved his command to Corregidor, which left the Luzon force in need of a commander. Major General Edward P. King, Jr., an artilleryman, was subsequently appointed and assumed command, with Major General Albert M. Jones taking command of 1st Corps and Major General George M. Parker retaining command of 2nd Corps. Before Wainwright left for Corregidor, he gave strict orders to Major General King not to surrender. Over the next 2 weeks, his soldiers' attempt to obey that order would ultimately end in tragedy. On 3 April, the Japanese launched a major operation against 2nd Corps with a sustained aerial and artillery bombardment that pummeled the Corps' western flank. Infantry from the Japanese 4th Division and 65th Brigade then began their attack. After 4 months of little sleep, increasing sickness, and less food, the soldiers who defended the Orion-Bagak line were operating at less than 50%. As a result, the Japanese were able to break through the 2nd Corps' line of defense. Outflanked, Major General King ordered 1st Corps to reinforce 2nd Corps for a counterattack. With the help of what tanks remained in the Provisional Tank Group and the remaining soldiers of both Jones' Philippine Scouts of the 45th Infantry, with the American 31st Infantry Regiment, General Parker's 2nd Corps attempted a counterattack on 6 April. When the Philippine 31st Infantry Division moved out of its bivouac area at Lamau for the attack, it left behind approximately 1/3 of its soldiers who were in need of medical attention. Still, many of those same soldiers rose from their sickbeds to mount a defense. Wainwright later commented,
Bataan was a hopeless hell, where everything was bad, except the will to live the memories of home, as torturous as they sometimes could be, and the ever-dimming hope that the great country we represented would somehow find a way to help us.
Unfortunately, the Japanese had also planned an attack for the same day. When the various actions were over, the Japanese had driven a wedge between the two corps, occupied Mount Samat, the dominant height on Bataan, and were poised to attack 2nd Corps' exposed western flank for a push towards Manila Bay. Though both corps attempted to reform their defensive line over 7 and 8 April, the Japanese were too strong and too well supplied, forcing the defenders to withdraw to the docks at Maribalis, with the intention of falling back to Corregidor. With the hospital having already been the target of Japanese air attacks, General King was concerned that if his forces continued to resist, the wounded and their attendant medical staff would face capture or be killed piecemeal. Without notifying General Wainwright, he decided to surrender his remaining forces. On 9 April, he met with Japanese Major General Kamichiro Nagano and arranged terms of surrender for his soldiers on Luzon. With Luzon under their control, the Japanese looked to attack Corregidor next. But before they could begin operations against Wainwright's last stronghold, they needed to move approximately 72,000 prisoners from Bataan. Unwilling to use limited assets to transport them to Camp O'Donnell, an army post converted to a prisoner of war camp, they force-marched the weakened soldiers 105 kilometers through the peninsula. Plagued by malnutrition, disease, and the added random cruelty of their captors, it is estimated that some 600 Americans and between 5,000 to 6,000 Filipinos died on the infamous Bataan Death March. As the prisoners marched north, the Japanese began planning their attack on the island of Corregidor. Located at the mouth of Manila Bay, Corregidor was well stocked, possessed numerous gun emplacements, and was fortified with a tunnel system capable of protecting its defenders from even the heaviest of bombardments. However, with the destruction of its barracks, water tanks, and power plant by aerial bombardment, and overwhelmed by the influx of soldiers who were able to make it off Bataan, its resources were pushed to capacity. Overcrowding, dwindling food supplies, and disease took their toll throughout the month of April. Beginning on 1 May, the Japanese proceeded their invasion of the island with a heavy artillery barrage that lasted until the night of 5 May. That night, 2 battalions from the Japanese 61st Infantry Regiment landed on the northeastern end of the island and established a beachhead. Soon, tanks and artillery were being brought ashore. In response, all available USAFE personnel, including sailors, artillerymen, and airmen, joined with the 4th Marine Regiment to defend the island. Unable to withstand the overwhelming enemy force, they fell back to a strong point on Malinta Hill, near the center of the island. Realizing his command of 11,000 soldiers and staff were unable to effectively defend the island any longer, and having been authorized by President Roosevelt to determine when and if the Philippines should be surrendered, General Wainwright made the decision to lay down arms on 6 May. In his final message to President Roosevelt and General MacArthur, Wainwright wrote,
"With broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame, I report that today we must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay. There is a limit of human endurance, and that limit has long since been passed. Without prospect of relief, I feel it is my duty to my country and to my gallant troops to end this useless effusion of blood and human sacrifice. We have done our full duty for you and for our country."
When he met with Lieutenant General Homa, Lieutenant General Wainwright tried to limit surrender terms to his forces on Corregidor. However, using threats against those who had already surrendered, the Japanese general insisted on the complete surrender of all USAFE forces in the Philippines, including those in the Bisayan Islands and on Mindanao. Not willing to endanger any more of his soldiers' lives, Wainwright agreed to Homa's demands. On 7 May, he broadcast surrender instructions from a radio station in Manila, for all forces in the Philippines.
This is Lieutenant General Wainwright. Subject, surrender. It became apparent that the garrison of these forces would be eventually destroyed by aerial and artillery bombardment and by infantry supported by tanks which have overwhelmed Corregidor. After leaving General Homer with no agreement between us, I decided to accept, in the name of humanity, his proposal. You will therefore be guided accordingly, and will, surrender all troops under your command to the proper Japanese officers. This decision, on my part, you will realize, was forced upon me by means entirely beyond my control.
The next morning, 8 May, he sent written orders to his commanders to surrender. By 9 June, the majority of Wainwright's forces had complied. Nevertheless, a number of soldiers continued to lead Filipino guerrillas against the Japanese for the remainder of the war. Even the earliest war plans for the Philippines recognized the difficulty in defending such a remote military outpost. Years later, MacArthur gave his opinion that after the crippling of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines' chances for sustained defense were drastically reduced, if not made impossible. When half of the Far East Air Force was destroyed on 8 December and Admiral Rockwell's naval forces departed for Australia, the ability to mount a joint defense of the island chain also became highly unlikely. Though MacArthur's defense of the islands was bold and well planned, it suffered from a lack of well-trained forces, outdated equipment, and too few supplies. It was also challenged by the lack of infrastructure and the restrictive terrain across much of Luzon, which made repositioning forces laboriously slow. Despite these severe disadvantages, U.S. and Filipino troops effectively delayed Japanese forces for 5 months, forcing them to expend significant blood and treasure to take the island chain.
It was the biggest day of General Hama's life, and 50,000 fanatic soldiers bought it for him with their lives. As far as the general was concerned, it would have been cheap at twice the price. Quote, Japan is prepared to lose 10 million lives in her war with America. How many is America prepared to lose?
Had this not been the case, and had the Philippines fallen quickly in accordance with Japan's strategy, they may have been able to extend their planned conquest of Southeast Asia further. This made the resolute defense mounted by General Wainwright's combined forces one of the few symbols of hope for America during the uncertain months following the attack on Pearl Harbor.
And Joe, don't for 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, ever forget that last message sent by a GI who saw his starved comrades, Americans and Filipinos, dying around him at Corregidor.
What you are about to hear now is a transcript of the radio messages that came out of Fort Mills, Corregidor on May 5th.
They are not near yet. We are waiting for God only knows what. The white flag is up. Everyone is bawling like a baby. They're piling dead, wounded soldiers in our tunnel. Corregidor used to be a nice place. It's haunted now. Get this to my mother. My love to Pa, Joe, Sue, Mac, Carrie, Joy, and Paul. Tell Joe, wherever he is, give him hell for us.
Just one word more. This isn't just another movie. Take it from me.